then he begins what is quite extensive teaching to Timothy. And his first teaching is actually a warning against false teachers. And he says, as I urged you when I went into Macedonia. Now, you know, Paul had a very clear-cut call to Macedonia. That's quite a story in itself, the Macedonian call. And because this was outside Israel, this was outside the Jewish people, Macedonia. And he says to Timothy, he says, stay in Ephesus. Look, when Paul went outside the Jewish faith to, well, Ephesus is in Turkey, but it was not particularly to the Jews. This was the breakthrough for Paul into the Gentiles. And he says to Timothy, stay in Ephesus. Of course, Ephesus was also in Turkey. But he said, well, it is today in Turkey. And but he simply says, stay in Ephesus. Now, to me, it's interesting because to me, the Ephesians were a very spiritual group. And it's very interesting because the most spiritual of all the epistles is the one to the Ephesians. And in fact, one of my books was based on that. If you want to know more, you should read that book. But he says, stay in Ephesus so that you may command certain men not to teach false doctrine. Wow. Now, this is something we've not dealt with before. Paul, even at this stage in the early church, is concerned about false doctrine, false teaching. Because he says, you command these men not to teach false doctrine any longer, nor to devote themselves to, and this is quite interesting how Paul describes it, not to devote themselves to myths, to endless genealogies. These promote controversy rather than God's work. And the danger is that over the years, there have developed various schools of so-called theology, but theology ends up by being endless description or discussion over issues which are not conducive to the simplicity of preaching the gospel. And I hope that this is a reputation that I have earned down through the years, that I refuse to be identified with the so-called doctrines of different groups. And I know, for example, when I began this great work of calling together denominations to pray in the Ukraine, that realizing the great divisions between these groups, that I said, look, we can only unite in prayer if we come back down to basics. And the basics are that you accept that the only instruction in the church is the Bible. The Bible is the basis of the church. And secondly, that you accept salvation is only in the name of Jesus. And you know, it keeps coming back to me that the trouble is in the church, so often we've got away from the simplicity and the purity of the gospel itself. And so he says that Timothy has to take responsibility as a young man to correct these others on their teaching. You see, he says in the next verse, in verse 5, the goal, the aim, the objective of this teaching is love. And our teaching has to be in love. We can't force and compel. And there are some religions who have strict codes, but they enforce them by law. I'm just thinking of, yes, let's put it bluntly, there are certain Muslim countries at the moment, Afghanistan is probably the worst and Iran is another, where they enforce their doctrine so strictly that they actually execute or imprison people who do not keep to their teaching. The gospel is preached in love. There cannot be a compulsion. You can't compel people to come in. It's love. And sometimes we have to come back to the basis. It is a gospel of God's love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. And he goes on in the next verse, in verse 6. Some have wandered away from this and turned to meaningless talk. I have to admit that when I'm free and I'm not preaching, often I slip into the back of a church to see what's going on. And I'm sad to say that with some of them I come away just thinking it's meaningless. They've got nowhere. It's easy to stand up and talk, but you need to do it from your heart, in love, with a strong message. And I think you'll find out when you listen to me, I do have a strong message. And so here, Paul is saying, some of these people have wandered away from the simplicity of the gospel and end up with meaningless talk. But now Paul here examines the reason why. Because he says, they want to be teachers of the law, but they, this is why I'm using this particular translation, because Paul is so blunt here. He says, they want to be teachers of the law, but they don't know what they're talking about. You can't get blunter or straighter than that. Paul is actually rebuking some of these people in Ephesus who don't know what they're talking about or what they so confidently affirm. You know, we have to live by the faith we preach. You know my story, how that all those years ago, God said to me when I was a pastor and an evangelist in England, he said, shut up, stop talking, go out and do yourself all the things you're telling other people to do. And my life for the past 60 years has simply been a demonstration that I've gone out to live it, to do it, to act it, and I don't tell people to do what I can't do and haven't done myself, including in London, preaching in the open air, preaching in cinemas, in theatres, in stadiums, in big, wherever, even in football fields and so on. But it's the fact that I've been out there, I've been doing it, and the fact that I haven't stopped. I'm going on doing it. And then he says in verse 8, we know that the law is good if one uses it properly.